The European Environment Agency published a report that identifies 36 climate risks with potentially severe consequences across Europe. It is 488 pages long. It was produced at the request of the European Commission, and almost nobody outside the policy world has read it. That is the problem. Not because you need to read 488 pages, but because this document is, underneath the climate science, a labor market forecast. When a risk is identified at the European level and classified as requiring urgent action, something predictable follows. Policy frameworks get created, funding gets allocated, regulations get adopted, and organizations need to build capacity to respond. That capacity is people, professionals with specific competences. I'm Anastasia. I read European Union regulations for a living and assessments like this one. Let me show you what this report actually says about where your career could be headed. Imagine this. Sitting in a policy office in Brussels right now, there is a stack of 488 pages that describes 36 risks to European life as we know it. Coastal cities, water supply, food production, public health, critical infrastructure, financial stability. And these 488 pages are used as an input for the policy. Most professionals will never read it. Their companies will react when the policy arrives, when funding is announced, when regulations hit. The ones who read it now are positioning themselves 2 to 3 years ahead of that moment. And that is the difference this video is about. The European Climate Risk Assessment evaluates 36 major climate risks organized into 5 interconnected clusters, plus water as a cross-cutting field. Let me walk you through the structure, because the structure tells you where the demand for jobs is. Cluster 1 – Ecosystems. Picture a stretch of the European coastline, not somewhere specific, any coastline. The agency rates coastline ecosystem risks at the highest severity and confidence level across all time horizons. Sea level is rising at an accelerating pace. Salt marshes are drowning, dunes are eroding. The ecosystems that have protected European coasts for centuries are in some places failing within decades. That is Cluster 1 – terrestrial, freshwater marine and coastal ecosystems. Policy readiness across all of them is a medium, which means the gap between what needs to happen and what is happening is large. Cluster 2 – food. Consider this. Crop production in Southern Europe is already at critical risk. But what makes this cluster career relevant is the cascade. Climate impacts on food production cascade to rural livelihoods, to land use, to the health of vulnerable populations, and to the wider economy. And here is the risk most people outside trade policy have never considered. European food security depends partly on imports from regions that are themselves experiencing climate shocks. A drought in Argentina, floods in Southeast Asia. The agency classifies food security from climate impacts outside Europe as an European Union level risk requiring action. Cluster 3 – Health. Now picture an outdoor construction worker in Seville in August, or a farm laborer in southern Italy during a heat wave, or an elderly resident in a Paris apartment without air conditioning. Heat stress is rated as the highest urgency level in the entire report. Heat waves are linked to between 60 to 70,000 premature deaths in Europe every year. Wildfire risk to population and buildings in Southern Europe are critical. Vector-borne diseases are moving northward as temperatures rise. This is Cluster 3, and it requires urgent short-term policy action. Cluster 4 – Infrastructure. Think about what happens during a major flood. Not the flood itself, but the cascade. Power goes off, telecommunications fail, transport stops, water supply is compromised, and hospitals operate on backup generators. Coastal flooding could exceed 1 trillion euros per year in damages by the end of the century without action. Energy systems in Southern Europe face substantial risk from heat and drought. Transport networks are exposed, infrastructure assets are networked, interconnected, which means a failure in one system cascades to the rest. Cluster 5 – Economy and Finance. And here is where it reaches your savings, your mortgage and your pension. European solidarity mechanisms are already at critical risk level. Public finances, property and insurance markets, supply chain disruptions, all rated as needing more action. Financial markets risk could reach catastrophic level by the end of the century. Cutting across all 5 clusters is water security. Droughts, scarcity, competition for water, it affects every other system. And here's the career signal embedded in this structure. Every cluster where the agency says urgent action needed or more action needed is an area where investment must flow, capacity must be built, and professionals must be hired. That investment splits into 2 streams, and the difference between them determines what kind of professional the next decade is paying for. Let me show you both. Most climate discussions collapse adaptation and mitigation into one vague category, climate action. But for career positioning, the distinction is essential, because the competences are different. Mitigation is about reducing the cost of climate change, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, transitioning to renewable energy, decarbonizing industry, carbon capture, changing how we produce, consume, and transport. Mitigation addresses root causes. It slows the changes coming. Adaptation is about managing the consequences of climate change, building flood defenses, redesigning cities for heat, protecting ecosystems so they can absorb shocks, developing drought-resistant agriculture, creating early warning systems. Adaptation addresses impacts that are already locked in, because even if we stopped all emissions today, decades of warming have already happened. And both adaptation and mitigation are hiring, but they are hiring for different things. Let me start with adaptation. It is the largest of the 2 categories, and the one most professionals underestimate. Adaptation jobs exist at the intersection of climate science, engineering, ecology, and planning. 6 areas where the risk assessment directly translates into professional demand. Area 1 is coastal protection and ecosystem restoration. The agency rates coastal ecosystem risks at the highest severity and confidence level. Sea level is rising at an accelerating pace. Coastal flooding risks are growing exponentially. The response requires both hard engineering and nature-based solutions. The most effective strategies combine both. Dune restoration, salt marsh creation and management, managed realignment of coastlines, coastal sediment management, these are not marginal activities. They are becoming core infrastructure programs in the Netherlands, Denmark, the UK, Germany, and increasingly in Southern Europe. The roles here are coastal engineers, marine ecologists, sediment transport specialists, nature-based solution designers, coastal zone planners, and GIS specialists who can model sea level rise scenarios for specific coastlines. Area 2. Wildfire prevention and landscape management. Wildfires in 2022, 2023, 2024 and 2025 had catastrophic impacts on ecosystems, carbon storage, settlements and health. The agency classifies wildfire risk to biodiversity and carbon sinks as requiring urgent action, particularly in Southern Europe but also increasingly further north. Wildfire prevention is not just about firefighting. It's about prescribed burning, fire break design, early detection systems, community evacuation planning. It requires professionals who understand forest ecology, fire behavior modeling, and land use planning. The roles here are wildfire risk analysts, prescribed fire practitioners, forest management planners, remote sensing specialists for fire detection, landscape ecologists, and community resilience coordinators. Area 3. Biodiversity protection and pollinator measures. The agency identifies biodiversity loss from droughts, pests, and habitat fragmentation as a critical risk that cascades to food production, carbon storage, and ecosystem services. Pollinators are a specific pressure point. Their decline affects crop yields, food security, and agricultural economy. The European Union Nature Restoration Law, their biodiversity strategy, their natural pollinator action plans create demand for professionals who can design and implement habit corridors, monitor species populations, assess ecosystems' health, and integrate biodiversity objectives into agricultural and urban planning. The roles here are conservation biologists, pollinator ecologists, habitat restoration specialists, environmental monitoring technicians, agri-environment scheme advisors, and biodiversity data analysts. Area 4. Water security and drought management. Water cuts across every cluster. Prolonged droughts are degrading the water resources that agriculture, industry, power generation, river transport, and ecosystems depend on. Europe faces growing risk of mega droughts spanning large regions for several years. The response requires water efficiency technologies, drought early warning systems, groundwater management, water use infrastructure, and the redesign of water allocation systems that were built for a stable climate that no longer exists. The roles here are hydrologists, water resource engineers, drought risk modelers, agriculture water efficiency specialists, water reuse and recycling engineers, and integrated water resource management planners. Area 5. Heat-resilient cities and buildings. Heat stress requires urgent action across the general population, and particularly for outdoor workers. Buildings designed for historical climate conditions are becoming health hazards during heat waves. About 9% of the European Union citizens cannot keep their homes adequately warm during the winter, but increasingly the problem is also keeping them cool. The response requires urban heat mapping, green infrastructure design, passive cooling in buildings, heat health action plan development, and climate proofing of building standards. The Eco-Code's European standards guiding structural design are being updated but still largely rely on historical climate data. Incorporating climate projections into building standards is in itself a professional specialization. The roles here are urban climate specialists, bioclimatic architects, green infrastructure designers, building performance assessors, heat health planners, and climate adaptation urban planners. Area 6. Climate-resilient agriculture. Crop production in Southern Europe is at critical risk. The food cluster shows cascading impacts from food production failures to livelihoods, land use, public health, and economy. Adaptation in agriculture means drought-resistant crop varieties, precision irrigation, soil health management, agroforestry, diversified farming systems, and importantly, agricultural insurance and catastrophe response mechanisms. The roles here are climate-smart agronomists, precision irrigation engineers, agroforestry designers, agricultural climate risk assessors, crop insurance specialists, and soil scientists specializing in resilience. Mitigation is hiring the other half of this story, and the professionals who understand both adaptation and mitigation are the ones who command the highest value. Mitigation addresses the root cause, reducing emissions that are driving these climate risks. The risks create the urgency and the policy mandate for mitigation investments. Here are 4 areas. Area 1. Renewable energy deployment and grid resilience. The agency identifies energy disruption from heat and drought as a substantial risk, particularly in Southern Europe. The energy system must simultaneously decarbonize and become resilient to the climate impacts it's already experiencing. This means renewable energy deployment must accelerate while the grid itself is climate-proofed. The roles here are renewable energy project developers, grid resilience engineers, energy storage specialists, power purchase agreement specialists, and energy system modelers who can integrate climate scenarios into infrastructure planning. Area 2. Industrial decarbonization. The broader European Union climate framework, Fit for 55, the emissions trading system, the Clean Industrial Deal, they create regulatory pressure. Every energy-intensive industry must reduce emissions while adapting its operations to a changed climate. The roles here are industrial process engineers, carbon accounting specialists, emissions trading analysts, clean technology integration engineers, and circular economy specialists who can reduce material and energy use. Area 3. Carbon capture and storage and nature-based climate solutions. Wildfires are destroying carbon sinks. Ecosystem degradation reduces nature's capacity to absorb emissions. This creates demand for professionals who can protect and enhance natural carbon storage. Through forest management, peatland restoration, blue carbon project in coastal wetlands, and soil carbon management in agriculture. The roles here are carbon capture and storage project managers, peatland restoration ecologists, blue carbon scientists, forest carbon inventory specialists, and natural capital accountants. Area 4. Sustainable mobility and transport decarbonization. Transport accounts for roughly a quarter of European greenhouse gas emissions. Mitigation in this area requires electric vehicle infrastructure, rail and shipping decarbonization, sustainable aviation fuel development, and the restructuring of urban and freight mobility systems around lower carbon alternatives. The European Union's Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, the FuelEU Maritime Regulation, and the ReFuelEU Aviation Regulation create the policy backbone. The capital is flowing. The roles need to be filled. And the roles are electromobility engineers, sustainable fuel specialists, rail electrification engineers, shipping decarbonization specialists, urban mobility planners, and charging infrastructure developers. I have just walked you through 10 areas, 6 for adaptation and 4 for mitigation, more than 50 specific roles. But here is what I noticed when I mapped them all against the source document. 4 competences appear again and again. Across every area, every role, the professionals who develop these 4 will have career mobility across every area I just described. And these are the ones worth naming. The first one is climate data literacy. The ability to read, interpret, and apply climate projections, scenario analysis, and risk assessments. Not as a climate scientist, but as a professional who uses climate data to inform decisions in engineering, planning, agriculture, finance, or policy. These competences barely exist in the current workforce outside academia. 2. Cascade and systems thinking. The most important thing to understand about climate risk is how it cascades across systems. A drought is not just a water problem. It is an agricultural, energy, transport, health, and economic problem simultaneously. Professionals who can see across sector boundaries and identify cascade pathways are rare and in growing demand. 3. Regulatory navigation. The adaptation and mitigation responses are driven by an expanding regulatory stack. The European Union Adaptation Strategy, the Nature Restoration Law, the Critical Entities Resilience Directive, the Water Framework Directive, the Common Agricultural Policy, the Emissions Trading System, the European Union Biodiversity Strategy, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, the Floods Directive, the Euro Codes, and much more. Professionals who can translate this regulatory environment into operational decisions hold the key between policy objectives and implementation. 4. Financial translation. Climate risks are also risks to public finance, insurance markets, solidarity mechanisms, and the wider financial system. Adaptation and mitigation both require investments. Professionals who can translate climate risk into financial language like cost-benefit analysis, return on adaptation investment, insurance modeling, green bond structuring, bridge the gap between what science recommends and what gets funded. And the most valuable professionals are not single-discipline experts. They are translators, people who can move between climate science, engineering, regulation, and finance. Now apply the 4-step framework from the first video. What must businesses, cities, and public institutions do differently because of these 36 risks? What competences are needed to do it? Which roles will need those competences? And where is the gap between what exists now and what will be needed? The gap is larger than the market has priced in yet. Because climate risk is not a future topic anymore. It is a current hiring signal. The professionals who read this assessment as a labor market document, the way I just walked you through it, are already 3 years ahead of those who will wait for the job postings to catch up.